Welcome to RISE Learning Machines seminars. RISE is Sweden's Public Research Institute, and this is our open weekly seminar on AI and machine learning. This meeting will be recorded, and let us know if you want to be removed from this recording. We put all our seminars on our YouTube channel, so please go there and check out all the great talks we have there already. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Santiago Martinez Balvanera, who is a PhD candidate at University College London. Santiago works on investigating machine learning methods for extracting ecological insights from audio data. And the topic today is data-driven bat monitoring, leveraging machine learning for effective solutions. And with this said, I will stop my sharing and hand over the screen share and word to you, Santiago.
Thanks. 1 second. Okay, so I guess I'll start. So yeah, first of all, I'd really like to thank Olof and John Martinson for the very kind invitation to talk here at this seminar. I'm really happy and honored to be presenting and sharing some of the research I've been doing. So I will talk about data-driven bat monitoring through sound, and in particular how machine learning plays a big part in this idea of biodiversity monitoring. So I will give you a brief overview of what I will be talking about in the presentation. So first of all, I'll just give you a bit of context about me, my motivation, and my background for working on this topic. Then I will tell you about how ML is in particular being used for doing acoustic monitoring of biodiversity, and what is the overall structure of how people are thinking of doing this as a pipeline for getting data. Then we'll go into details about, so how do you go about building annotation sets for developing machine learning models? How do you do annotation in practice? What kind of model considerations do you need to think about when trying to deploy or when trying to develop machine learning solutions for the detection of bats and other animal sounds? How do you exploit as well existing data resources? Because I will talk also of several data challenges that we face. And finally, how we improve the data collection practices with machine learning. So the personal story begins, I'm from Mexico. I was really fortunate to grow in this very biodiverse country and visit the field many, many times throughout my life. And of course, throughout my growing years, it was always evident that human activity was constantly and increasingly changing the environment in ways that have a big impact on the where animals can move, what the health of ecosystems are, and of course, I am not by background a biologist or ecologist. I actually ended up studying mathematics, but this kind of vision of a rapid changing world and a need to understand how it's changing deeply motivated my journey throughout my mathematical years and afterwards. So the changes I saw during my early years in Mexico are actually not just regional to Mexico. Unfortunately, it is a global trend that we are seeing huge or very important biodiversity declines across many different species, many different ecosystems. And this alarming trend hasn't gone unnoticed. The international community now has acknowledged the severity of the situation and has done loads of efforts to address it in a focused manner. There are several initiatives with the aim of reversing this trajectory of the biodiversity loss. However, in order to really try to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, there needs to be increased conservation efforts. And by that, that also means increased information of how to better manage conservation and land. And unfortunately, many of the existing methods for assessing and managing and kind of mitigating this biodiversity loss do not really scale up in the ways that are needed for a global management of this crisis. So here's where the idea of machine learning starts to crop up in the different aspects of biodiversity monitoring. I began my journey working at this government agency in Mexico called CONABIO, that is tasked of gathering information about biodiversity across the whole country. And it is where I kind of started joining my mathematics background with this idea of trying to do something for managing biodiversity loss. And I entered this team as a data scientist. I was kind of tasked or thinking about increasing the capacity of the Mexican government to do monitoring at the national level, and through different tools. Although I was inserted into the team that was doing bioacoustic monitoring. So bioacoustic monitoring is a kind of a really interesting and useful tool to understand ecosystems, because many different organisms make sound, and just by placing a single device somewhere, you can have this really high resolution and detailed information about what are the activity of these different organisms are. And also the devices for monitoring are getting increasingly cheap, so now it's reasonable to deploy several of them on the field, and they're very hands-off and non-invasive. So they've been proposed as a very efficient way of doing this scale, biodiversity monitoring at scale. However, like all of these data collection, without some sort of automation, there is absolutely no way that data is going to be helpful, since there is no way humans can kind of extract all the relevant data or information that is stored within these recordings. So machine learning is kind of this pivotal or cornerstone of this whole proposed idea of doing large-scale acoustic monitoring, as it will allow processing automatically these audio recordings in order to be able to extract the information that ecology researchers need. For example, when some animals making sound, when some behavior can be inferred. Despite these promises of machine learning, the reality is that in practice, there's a lot of difficulties when it comes to applying machine learning to, for example, the detection and classification of bats. So first of all, data collection, well, as any machine learning project knows, you need loads of data for training and the development of these models. But the unfortunate reality is that data collection is really hard to do. For example, when you're handling bats, the only way of being absolutely certain that you are recording a specific species of a bat is to capture it first, release it, and record it. So this is a very hands-on, very expensive endeavor, which translates into the fact that actually we have very few data for many of the thousands of species that exist in the wild. Despite this promising, there are still a lot of challenges of how exactly do we take this idea of using machine learning and build a pipeline for biodiversity monitoring with it for audio data. And so after working a bit in CONABIO, I decided to pursue a PhD, and we'll focus on how to use machine learning for very different aspects of the whole pipeline for acoustic biodiversity monitoring. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, in general, different problems I've tackled throughout my PhD and how machine learning has helped me, I've used machine learning in each of these challenges. So first of all, I would like to kind of give a very high-level overview of what people are thinking an acoustic monitoring pipeline looks like. So everything begins with data collection. So this is what I already mentioned. You go out on the field, set some devices out there, let them record for a while, and then eventually you get to the point that you need to collect all the data, to centralize all the data that has been collected and keep in some central server for reference. Then there comes this very difficult and labor-intensive process also of data annotation. So many times we just record a bunch of data, but then some expert taxonomist or some expert bioacoustician needs to go and look at the recordings and hear the recordings and identify the sounds with a high level of confidence. Then comes the part where you use all these data annotation expert information about which sounds are present in your data, and you try to do some sort of model development for some detector classifier. Model evaluation is also quite challenging in the sense that once you try to develop these systems for monitoring in the wild, you kind of hope that these models can generalize to unseen scenarios. You wish to deploy these sensors in many different environments at many different times and recording contexts, and you hope that the model is going to be effective in all of these contexts. And for example, performance is not going to change depending on the context, so that you know that the signal you're looking at is coming not from differences in model performance, but difference in the real signal. So model evaluation is also a kind of complex issue. Then comes after you're happy that your model has been correctly developed and evaluated, then comes the part of deployment. And this usually means kind of connecting the whole pipeline of data collection, so that when data is transferred to a server, the server automatically processes the audio with some models, and you start using all of that information for ecological inference or for whatever purpose you have, but focused on this kind of conservation. So each of these steps have many different challenges. This process also is kind of iterative, so it doesn't end with model deployment. Once you have kind of a new model, you see which are the weak points of the model and what data you need to collect next and what other things you can do. So it's actually just iterative. So this is kind of the pipeline that we were thinking about of building whenever when I was working at Conagro, and the thing I think most about when I'm doing my research at PhD. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the components of that pipeline and how I've been working with that. So first of all is kind of this idea of data management and data annotation, or this challenge of data management and data annotation. So if we think about this process in the context of biodiversity monitoring and machine learning development, so what are the requirements of a system such as that? So one of the important things that we need to recognize when talking about monitoring systems using ML is that data and the context can change. So there's this distribution shift of data, for example, driven by things such as climate change or human-induced changes in the environment. And so, of course, there is no, if we expect data to change, there in this annotation process, there must be some continual renovation of annotation in order to follow the trend of the data. Then, of course, the type of range we're trying to cover with acoustic monitoring is quite large. So there are a huge amount of animals of very different types that are making sounds and which we would like to identify. But of course, all of these have very different acoustic characteristics, which means that annotation and review and like just understanding them is not something that can be done by a single person. You need to kind of fine tune your audio representation so that it adjusts to the different types of animals. Then, of course, again, related to the previous point, annotation is a collaborative work, especially when you're trying to do something, for example, nationwide. So you gather all the experts from the field on, for example, bats, which of course there are several, and all of them might have different ideas of taxonomy and identification skills. So you have to think about this data annotation as a collaborative process. And finally, as I mentioned before, it is also an iterative process where you do some training, or well, you use some annotation, you train a model, you review what the errors were, and then with that, you might identify errors in the annotation or just identify different data that you might need to collect. So one of the main things I've been working on my PhD is the development of an open source audio annotation tool called Humbat. So Humbat tries to kind of fit within these requirements. And we did test out different alternatives before, but none of them kind of match all of these requirements we had for annotation projects. So Humbat is an effort of trying to build a tool that's available for everyone so that everyone can kind of start their own annotation pipeline. So with Humbat, the idea is you import some data, some recordings. You can, for example, manage different data sets, all of which have, for example, potential information about the context in which they were recorded, which can also be very important when trying to identify the different sounds. There's a annotation interface. There's also kind of a review tool so that people can see other people's annotations, flag issues, comment on different clips of audio as a way of building consensus around kind of tricky identifications. And ideally, once you do that, you export all your annotations, do whatever you want with them on the side. So mainly that would be model development. And once you have a model, the model and the predictions, you can use those predictions again to import it back into Humbat and explore those predictions and explore where they're failing or not in comparison to the annotation. So that's kind of a that's a kind of a whole package of how do you do model development and annotation within the same tool without doing like any of the training. So this tool is open source. This is a GitHub name of the repository. You're happy to add any issues that you see. It's still kind of in the beta version, so there might be some bugs, but yeah, I'd be happy for people to start contributing with bugs or issues or whatever. So, okay, so now that we have model annotation, an annotation tool in our hands, then there's another question which might not be as immediate, which is, okay, we have this pool of experts that are willing to annotate. We have a tool for annotation. How should we instruct experts to annotate? Does that kind of impact model performance when we, for example, if they follow a different annotation protocol? So usually the way people train these bat or bird detection and classifier is that you have a recording in which you know there's some species across the whole file. And in some cases, you might, instead of having like this label at the file level, you have it kind of segment the files and you have different clips within the recording and you have the name of the species that appears within each clip. So these kind of weak labels are then used to train a convolutional neural network classifier. And much of the development in deep learning for bioacoustics is some kind of version of this pipeline, at least like the big models such as BirdNet, for example. So we were wondering, okay, so maybe this is not the best approach. We don't have that much data to begin with, so maybe we can just annotate it a bit with more detail and see whether that makes any difference. So what we did is instructed the experts to do this kind of very detailed annotation, where they traced out the whole pulse of each bat echolocation call together with harmonics. And we did this for a large data set of bat recordings that we had from Mexico. And then each of these annotations, we could then kind of convert it into annotations of different levels of precision in terms of like the information, temporal and frequency information. And we augmented this kind of traditional way of training a classifier by adding a different branch that was kind of tasked to also locate each of the pulses with the level of the different annotations. So this multitask approach, what it showed us is that actually when you have very few recordings or samples per species, it can make a big impact on the classification performance at the end. So for example, when we did experiments with 10 examples per species, and we saw an improvement of over 10% in some cases. In general, there was an improvement, except in the case where there was really few data. And we didn't see any big difference between the different types of annotations. So nowadays, we just recommend doing kind of bounding box annotations to all our experts in all our projects, because I think it's kind of a good balance between having detail but not spending too much time annotating. Then another question about model performance in particular is, okay, we've just mentioned that one of the basic ways of building these classifiers and detectors is taking kind of out of the box convolutional neural networks and training a classifier. But for example, is that the right architecture to use for sound, and in particular for bats? Could we maybe use some of the information about how bats echolocate and the particularities of that sound to inform architecture selection? So convolutional neural networks are very good for image data in particular, because they are kind of this, they have baked-in translational invariance, but these translational invariants might not make the most sense in the case where you have audio data, because most of the audio data is transformed into a spectrogram. The spectrogram has this special axis, which is the frequency, and different levels of the frequency do not have the same meaning. So the analogous example here of the cat face being lowered, that would make a very different sound, and that does appear that does happen in the bat world. We could have two species that have very similar looking sounds calls, but just differ from very small differences in frequency. So translation invariance might not be the best idea for classifying bat calls. And second of all, most of the time bats fly around, they do these very periodic calls, and the interval between the calls is also indicative of the species. So you can sometimes discriminate between two species just by looking at the interpol's frequency. And these convolutional neural networks are not the most efficient at aggregating information at these longer temporal scales. And so our question was, okay, can we maybe add these two insights into the architecture and see whether it would help? So that's what we tried. The way of adding this kind of temporal reasoning is by adding a self-attention layer at the middle of this encoder-decoder architecture. And this self-attention mechanism kind of allows the whole network to do reasoning on a long temporal scale. And we saw that this architecture very dramatically outperform other alternatives when trained on UK a data set of UK bat sounds. We've also tried training it on data sets of Mexican, Australian, and Brazilian bat sounds, but those were really small. And although we do see good performance for detection of bat calls, the classifications are not indicative because the training samples are just too small. Anyways, this kind of does hint towards that maybe looking at improved architectures with better inductive biases focused on bioacoustic sounds might lead to better performance even when you have few data.
Question.
Yes.
In this encoder and the decoder blocks, what do you have there? Is it just a multi-layer perceptron? You don't have any convolutions, for example?
There are convolutional layers, and so there are modified convolutional layers that also concatenate kind of the frequency coordinates as a special channel, as a way of trying to give that information explicitly to the model.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So now that kind of there's a lot of research still to do on just trying to improve performance on the small data sets that we have. But a reality is that nowadays there's an increasing amount of existing public data of bat calls appearing. So, for example, there's this repository of recordings called Xenocanto, which has a massive data set of birds. And nowadays it's starting to accept bat recordings. There's also the open data set from the North American bat monitoring program. And so one of the questions is, okay, that might not be the reality in a very data poor region, for example, Colombia. But there's still sufficient, or not sufficient, but there's still loads of examples from different ecosystems and from different species. So how can we harness that data to enhance model performance even on these smaller data sets? And this kind of leads to the question of, okay, so we know there are several ways of doing this transfer learning and domain adaptation, but which one is going to give us the best performance for these multiple data sets of bat recording? So we are in the process of doing some very initial explorations. So one of the things we've seen is that, for example, by training on our largest data set so far, we have a hands-on, which is the UK data set. We used the model I mentioned, the bat detector, and transferred it to the Yucatan Peninsula. However, the transfer was not effective in the sense that the performance of the transferred model was not significantly higher than the model that was just trained from scratch with all the data we had. And that possibly can be explained due to the still small scale of the bat data set from the UK. So we're actually in the process of contacting several collaborators from across the globe, where we will be collecting several data sets of regional bat calls, each of which have different species. And with that, we can start doing this exploration around the question of how do you do transfer learning in this context. And finally, there's this other part of the pipeline, which is also very important, which maybe doesn't have to do too much with model development, but in which machine learning can also play a big part, which is there's this problem that these audio pipelines or this audio monitoring generates huge amounts of data. For example, when I was working at Conavio, the devices were sent out to the field. They were recording for a whole month, and then the devices or the memory cards of the devices were sent out by mail or by some sort of physical transfer to the capital city where the servers were. And this is because network connectivity in many of these regions is so poor that just uploading a full 64 gigabyte memory card is unfeasible most of the times. And also this data transfer in the mail and stuff is all very unreliable, and you lose track of which recording comes from which. And all of that, of course, is undesirable if you want to build a good system for understanding where biodiversity is at. So one of the things we were wondering in this case, so how can we alleviate these transfer and storage burdens? And in particular, is there a way that we can exploit this idea of edge processing to kind of circumvent these challenges? And this is not definitely a new idea. For example, few years past, there was this open source model for bird identification called BirdNet published, and some other researchers developed a Raspberry Pi solution that could run the BirdNet model, and then it would run continuously and send the detections of the model to a central server. So we were thinking, okay, we'd really like to replicate this idea, but with the BAT model we already had. In particular, there was this project that was started by my supervisor 5 years ago, where they placed what they called echo boxes, which are small devices that could run some very early bat detector model, and placed it across a park here in London. And they have been continuously monitoring bat activity in the park for 5 years or more. But the model is so outdated that we now want to update it to the new version that we know it's has much better classification performance for species. And we were looking at adapting, for example, this BirdNet Pi framework, but we didn't find the process very easy. And in general, there's kind of a lot of complexity in developing these kind of smart sensors or artificial intelligence, Internet of Things sensors, due to many different technical challenges. So one of the things that also we've been working on is developing a Python framework, which is called Occupy. And this Python framework, what we want it to be is something that gives all of the engineering, or takes all of the engineering challenges away of building these smart sensors, and gives the user the possibility of bringing their own model of whatever bioacoustic detector and classifier they have, and with very little code, having a very robust system that can automatically do audio recording, processing on the device, sending information to some remote server, and storaging and everything in a fault-tolerant way. So this is in the process. I think we're expecting to open source this project within the next 2 months. So yeah. So yeah, of course, these are the things I have been exploring throughout my PhD. But when thinking about this robust acoustic monitoring system, there are many other challenges that have emerged. And I think these challenges can also inspire machine learning research in a very meaningful way that can give back to these very important applications. So, for example, one of the issues that we have is when we're talking about these bat data sets from across the globe, in reality, even though we might try to make it as diverse as possible, data collection is never random. It is usually clustered in time and space, so people go out to a very specific site due to, I don't know, ease of access or other reasons. And so we have pockets of information in different sites, and we do not have like information across a whole gradient of environment. So there's these biases in data collection, and the question is, how can we counteract these biases with some strategy that incorporates these kind of dependencies into model training and into model evaluation? Because otherwise, we might not be able to, for example, make the claim that something is generalizable as we wish it would be. I think another issue that stems from the last project about the smart devices is, okay, so how do you, first of all, think about, once you have a model that you know performs in a way or another, and you know that you need to collect more data, is there a way that machine learning, and particularly reinforcement learning, can help devise smarter sampling strategies that aid or guide the ecologist to collect data from specific sites? So identify hotspots for data, or for places where data is missing, in order to achieve better performance. Of course, these edge devices are not as powerful and are very power hungry, and one constraint, or that's a very high constraint on building these monitoring systems that are long-lived, especially in places where there's no availability of power, only, for example, from a solar panel. So there's this other issue of optimizing models in order to be able to run efficiently in edge devices. And finally, we do have all of this recorded data, but there's, in contrast to many other machine learning data sets, these data often come with loads and loads of metadata from when they were recorded, where they were recorded, what's kind of the description of the environment, sometimes temperature, humidity, and many other variables that we know influences the way, for example, sound travels, the emission of sound. And so I guess there still hasn't been a lot of exploration of how do you leverage all that additional information to improve model training. So I think overall, machine learning can help in many different aspects or many different points within kind of this idea of acoustic monitoring pipelines for scaled biodiversity monitoring. And there's a lot of opportunity of synergies between both ecologists, computer scientists, mathematicians, statisticians to tackle these real world and hard problems. And I think that's all I have for you. Might have been too fast, but I really like to end by thanking everyone who has worked with me, in particular my supervisors, Kate Jones and Ocean McKay, but as well as many other people from Mexico and from across the world who have been interested in my research and have helped me in my journey. So, yeah, I guess I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Santiago. Do we have some questions from the audience? I can start asking a question. You were talking about this project where this system of collecting data that will be more sort of self-sustainable with sort of solar power and wireless connectivity, and you said you would publish something open source in a few months, but what's the timeline on when could this be operational?
So when we were designing this project, we thought it would be best to kind of partition it into different challenges. So for what we're going to open source, particularly we're focusing on kind of the engineering challenges of building the software to support this. So the framework we're open sourcing is something that whoever wants can like use and build a software system or an application that runs on the edge device. And then there's the other challenge of, okay, so what's the best hardware to use with that? What type of solar panel? What are the energy requirements for this device and stuff like that? And those things we haven't tackled. And also because it is very highly dependent on the deployment and the resources you have at your availability. So for example, people who deploy these devices in urban environments do not have this restriction of power consumption. Or, for example, sometimes there is no Wi-Fi connectivity, but you can have kind of a network of LoRa devices. And so in this case, you might also need to think about attaching a LoRa emitter to the Raspberry Pi. So we think each deployment will have their own challenges. We do not aim to be kind of develop a final solution for that, but we do want to help with the software, which is also kind of a very hard challenge. And particularly now you have a new model, you have to start again building a whole new smart system, making that shorter.
And the projects that you are working with, then you're working with these small devices with the SD cards, and you have to manually go there to sort of supervise them.
Usually that is the case. So for example, in Mexico, there are several large monitoring projects that send out these devices to the field, and then they just expect the SD cards. But the idea of these new, of these smart monitoring systems would be that only detections get transmitted through the network. So sometimes that is it is a much smaller payload that it is possible to transfer through a cellular network or some other kind of communication protocol. Yeah.
Right. We have a raised hand from Andreas.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. Great talk. I work with bats and manual identification and bat service in northern Sweden, and I've also done a bit of coding, so I know also the difficulties in assigning species to bats, and I'm wondering about your application and model, whether it is always trying to assign a species if it's a bat call, or if it first goes to group and then see whether we stay at the group level, or if it goes down to species when a distinction, a finer distinction, isn't possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, the predictions of the model includes two kind of probability confidence thresholds. So one, the model provides some score of how confident that whatever it's detecting is a bad call in general, without regard of the species. And then there's another probability assigned to the species. And yeah, if you use a trained model, those would be, there's a list of 17 UK species, so that might not be as helpful in other places. But we have tested what's the reliability of just detecting bad calls, and that does seem to transfer quite well, even, for example, to Brazil and to Australia. So we did have good detection performance of bad pulses um, without the regards to the species.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering with the specifics of overlap and the non-determinable species, when it's either one of these two,
Yeah.
and if it's very close to one, can it ever group them up and give confidence to each species, or and then say it's either one of these? So does the model have to say one particular species?
Yeah, it is trained as a kind of a classifier, so it is forced to give so that probability of all species is sums to one. So you do have that constraint. I think it is hard. Haven't done too much work. Of course, in the poor performing species in the UK are the Myotis group, which all have very similar sounding calls, and that's very well reflected in the performance. There's lots of confusion between those species. So yeah, that's one thing. Another kind of benefit about the way we train the model is that you can also extract features. So it will predict all the places where it thinks there's a bad call within the spectrogram, and kind of a bounding box for that. But it also kind of gives you a feature vector that is then used for classification. And you can extract that feature vector and use it for other purposes. So, for example, you could also use those feature vectors to study those more subtle or nuanced differences in vocalizations between different groups of bats.
For social calls and feeding buses and like the behavior of the bat as well, then I guess.
Yeah, haven't seen. I mean, we don't have too much social or behavioral annotated data, so we don't know how reliable those features are for doing that kind of work. But it's definitely very interesting to think about.
So we have a raised hand from Esan.
Hey, yes. Thank you for sharing your experiences and knowledge. I'm interested into the transfer learning part you've done. I'm curious if you do any analysis or training analysis before actually doing transfer learning and know if this process will help you or not.
Sorry, what do you mean by analysis? What do you mean?
For example, you might check the distribution of your data in the source and target domain, and check if the target domain will help you, or if you train a model on the target domain, it will be better if you pre-train it on the source domain. But do you know any like exactly analysis that can help you before doing any kind of transfer learning? Because you also mentioned some cases that transfer learning was not effective on some data sets, right?
I don't know any way of figuring out a priori whether transfer learning will help or not. I mean, the way we've been doing it is very kind of empiric. We just test it out compared to doing it just training without the transfer learning and also with random initialization and see how how performance changes with those options. So no, your comment about that we saw that transfer learning was ineffective is in the way that, well, what I mean by that is that we did kind of train the model first on the UK data. We then fine-tuned that to the Mexico data, and the performance we achieved was almost the same as just training on the Mexico data exclusively. So yes, we haven't seen that yet. And of course, there's a recent paper by several people, including some at Google Brain, who did this kind of wide-scale analysis of transfer learning for bioacoustic sounds using a pre-trained model on bird sound. And there's a lot of interesting discussions around what are kind of the best approaches. So, for example, they found out that doing some pre-training on bird data is better than doing pre-training on a larger data set, but of like random audio from YouTube. So it's not only kind of a question of quantity of data, but also kind of how similar a line is to your task.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we will thank Santiago there for this talk. Next week, welcome back, March 21st. We'll have Fredrik Gustafsson, who is a postdoc researcher at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. He's going to talk about uncertainty quantification in regression models and under distribution shifts. Welcome back.